Hello, everybody. My name is Bob Massey, and I'm the co-host of this video podcast, Creating the World We Want. Today is a special day because it's the first day of our second season. We don't meet in a studio as we have in the first season. We are meeting in this form. And we are very proud to have today Chuck Collins, who's from the Inequality Project, a part of the Institute for Policy Studies. I just, as a point of personal information, I've known Chuck for quite a long time. I consider him a deep friend, and I've admired the persistence, the quality of his work, and the ability to take on all of these complicated concepts about the American economy and the terrible inequality that has been unleashed, and to make them evident and understandable to so many of us. So, and Chuck has had a very interesting life. Obviously, he's in the middle of the thick of things today, and we are very eager at the end of our conversation to talk about what does all this mean for creating the world we want? What can we do? And if we succeed in moving forward into a new administration, what should we be looking to do as soon as possible to start getting our hands around this deep and persistent and devastating problem? So I'm going to ask my co-host, Tom Dodge, to say a few words, and then we will jump right into the questions. Tom?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. It's been an honor to build these types of conversations, and we're really excited for our second season and so honored to have Chuck here. Chuck, just to start things off, can you dive into your youth and how did you start experiencing civic activism? What were those early experiences that really started to lead to the person you are today?
Well, I think I should say, I was really, I was born on third base. I grew up in a wealthy family. My great grandfather was the meatpacker Oscar Mayer, and I grew up in a fairly affluent suburb of Detroit. So my first real understanding of the world was living in that bubble, if you will, and yet a couple of important things. One is I had a relationship to Detroit. My father worked in downtown Detroit, and as a kid, I remember going with him to work. I would go to see the Tigers play at Tiger Stadium on Michigan Avenue, the old Briggs Field, which was in the heart of an African-American neighborhood. So I had this experience of sort of crisscrossing the economic and racial divide and seeing the deep inequalities. And then when I was 7 years old, that was the Detroit riots, the uprising in Detroit in the hot summer, July 1967. And again, as a young person, I was just really curious as to what was going on. And asking questions of my parents and other adults around me. So I think that planted a seed in me that not all was well in the world. And it had to do with these inequalities. It had to do with both the racial divide and later, as I understood it, the sort of bigger economic divide. And as I grew older, I got a better picture of kind of where I fit in. So that's very much informed my understanding of the world and activism. And I think, early on, I was trying to make sense of this front row seat. So later, I got involved in issues around affordable housing in Worcester, Massachusetts, when I was like 18, doing tenant organizing. And I later working with tenants trying to buy their mobile home parks or buy their apartment buildings. So I had that acute front row seat to both privilege and advantage and economic deprivation and insecurity. And that, I think, formed a lot of how I understand the world.
Did you remain in Detroit? Did you leave to go to college? What happened there in those critical years?
Well, I lived at home and then at a private high school, Cranbrook School, boys prep school, till I was 17. But then when I was 17, I was the only person, in my high school prep school, which is very kind of modeled after a British boarding school. I was the only one not to go directly to college. I kind of wanted to have more life experience. And so I went to Worcester, Massachusetts, for 2 years. First year was kind of an organized internship apprenticeship program where I worked in a daycare center, where I worked as a tenant organizer. I worked with a photographer. I did these internships and then stayed for another year and did other odd jobs and worked as a male teacher in a daycare center. So all of that meant that I didn't go to immediately to college, that I kind of immersed myself into a community experience. And that, I think, helped, shape me. I should say I got involved also with the Clamshell Alliance, which was an effort to keep the Seabrook nuclear power plant from being built. So I was exposed to the tradition of nonviolent direct action, and became a trainer, in nonviolent direct action. So, and I was very much involved with sort of a Catholic worker community in Worcester. I wasn't raised in an active Catholic family, but I come from a Catholic culture, both German and Irish Catholic traditions. And so connecting with sort of the Dorothy Day Catholic worker movement was really very important to me in terms of my own spiritual life and political life.
Is that still part of your thinking? I'm speaking personally as a man who's very much guided by these questions of faith, and I'm curious whether they still form part of the foundation of who you are.
It's pretty central. I don't talk about it everywhere, and in fact, I find within progressive movements, or at least white progressive movements, sometimes there's a distrust of people who come from particularly a Christian or a faith tradition, but it totally informs my understanding of things. For instance, I think I was 26 when the U.S. bishops put out this pastoral letter on the economy, and I remember reading it closely, joining a study group, um, and some of those principles are very much with me. I mean, obviously the preferential option for the poor, that the moral measure of the success of the economy is how the most vulnerable people are doing, as opposed to, what's the median income or how wealthy are the wealthy. The real measure of the health and morality of an economy is how the most vulnerable people, immigrants and widows and orphans in the biblical sense, are doing. Um, and this fascinating idea that there is a social mortgage on capital, meaning that society has a claim, this whole idea like, I have all this wealth and it's mine. From a biblical and Old Testament perspective on wealth, there's no such thing as absolute wealth ownership. That society helped create it. Society has a moral claim on it. And when people talk about taxation and they say, hey, it's all my money, in the back of my head, I remember that basic teaching, which is no, none of this. We are passing through. None of this absolutely belongs to any of us.
That's so powerful, Chuck. So much of your work is centered around this theme of inequality. When were you first really introduced to the term? When did it start to invoke into the ethos of who you are and what all your work?
And if I could add, how did that play into your eventual decision about the money that you had at that time?
Yeah. Well, I think starting at age 7, and having parents who uh, were grappling with inequality themselves, living outside Detroit. Um, both my father and mother uh, provided some moral insights as I was growing older. And I remember my father saying to me, when you turn 21, you're going to inherit this substantial amount of money. It's going to be enough money that you actually don't have to work, but you really need to find work. Work is an important part of a meaningful life. And at some point you'll get control over the whole corpus of that money. um, I think it's use it for your education, and so I remember getting that and information probably when I was 16 or 17, and having it struck like, okay, I understood my parents had certain advantages. Started to understand I was living in a wealthy community. I didn't think it necessarily applied to me. I mean, I thought, well, I'll just go and start my life, and I'll become Chuck regular guy, and I'm going to move to Worcester, and I'll get a job, and all of a sudden, this multi-generational inherited wealth was sort of coming my way. And on the one hand, I was like thankful that my parents had been looking out for me and trying to help me think about how I could go to college without going into huge debt, which obviously today is even more challenging. But I also felt, wow, this really sets me apart. This really is a different experience than almost all the other people I am around. So I took that seed and I just let it percolate for a couple of years. And fortunately, I met a lot of, wise working class people who kind of took my hand and introduced me to, a whole other reality. There's a important person in my life named Juanita Nelson. Wally and Juanita Nelson were war tax resistors, African-American homesteaders who lived at Woolman Hill, a Quaker retreat center not far from where I was living. And Juanita, they had both great compassion for my dilemma, but they were also not afraid to ask me important questions. Juanita once asked me, how long would it take you with your own labor to save the amount of money that you're going to inherit? And I kind of thought about that thinking, okay, well, if I save $5,000 a year, it's going to take me a really long time, a couple of lifetimes. And so that's where I started to think, for both me personally, but also as a society, too much inherited wealth is not a good thing. I don't think it's a good thing for individual young people to be. I think it distorts their own path and journey. But I also think for a society, it's a bad thing to have a hereditary class of people who inherit substantial wealth and don't have to work and kind of de-link from the rest of society. So I think that was the conviction that led me to give away the inheritance I had and the money that had been given to me. It was very important to me that I not reject this gift. It was, so I wrote to my parents and asked for their acceptance that I make this decision. I really said, I need to do this for myself. Here's how it's informed me. And, had a really meaningful conversations with my father, at which point, he understood why I felt I needed to give this money away and make my own way. And my father is still alive, and he's a remarkable person in so many ways. But a decade later, he said to me, "Well, looking at you, you did the right thing. You did the right thing for yourself. It was what you needed to do to make your way in the world." And and the other thing.
How old were you when you?
I was 20. When I was 26, I got control over this. Today's maybe worth several $100 million. At the time, it was probably $500,000 in 1986 or whatever. So if I just left the money and let it park for a while and just let it grow, I'd probably have $6 or $7 million today. So it's not a super wealthy inheritance. It's not a top 1/10 of 1%, but comfortably in the 1%. It's what I had to do. For whatever reason, I think I might have been bottled up or confused, or there was something liberating for me in giving that money away and aligning my life with the values that I believed. It freed me to just be who I think I wanted to be, or who I was. The other thing is that it helped me understand how much other advantage I had. So I thought that the wealth was the advantage, when in fact there's 101 other ways in which I have privilege and advantage the wind at my back. I mean, and I've come to appreciate that it's multi-generational, that I'm from European immigrant heritage, that I come from a family of people who've owned houses, managed money, taught their children about money, that I had access to educational and other tools, that I had a sense of agency that came from my privilege, which was encouragement that, oh, you can do this, you can do something. When I was 8 years old, 19, whatever, well, actually, maybe I was more like, when I was 10 or 11 was the first Earth Day. And I had a great science teacher who taught me all about pollution and the environment. And so when it came time for Earth Day to come around, I was telling my parents about it. And my father said, well, you should create a leaflet. And he helped me create this leaflet on an old mimeograph stencil with all of my points. And he took it to his office and he ran it off on the mimeograph machine, and he came back with 100 copies of my leaflet. And I went around the neighborhood giving it to people. And the message there was, if you see something broken, do something about it. You can do something about this. As opposed to what I've now come to appreciate, that is not everybody's experience. A lot of people see what's wrong and they're discouraged from taking action, or don't stick your head up. You could get hurt. And for better or worse, I think the sense of agency is maybe one of the great privileges and advantages that I came from my various package of upbringing. So, and I think, to be honest, I feel like I'm still discovering all the ways that advantage works and how advantage sort of compounds or accelerates as for people like me, and how disadvantage also compounds and accelerates for other people.
The amount of privileges that are unseen continue to reverberate across society, and it's our job to really discuss them and to learn more about that. I think something that's not discussed enough is the difference between wealth and income. And I think that is a foundation, a lot of the research in your recent Billionaire Bonanza. Just for our audience, do you want to kind of dive into this important distinction and just how that influences your research?
Sure. I mean, the context is we've lived through 4 decades of extraordinary inequality, both in income and in wealth. Income is important because it sort of tells us what's going on an annual basis, how much income comes into certain households, the gap between highest paid and lowest paid worker. Those are a number of important indicators of inequality. I've been particularly interested in wealth because I think of it as the sort of the archeology of multi-generational accumulations of advantage and disadvantage. So I like to think that the racial wealth divide, for instance, is, tells us really how white supremacy affects wealth building and assets. But simply put, wealth is what you own minus what you owe. And for certain households, who are, say, in the top 1%, a lot of what they own is not just a home and some savings, but a lot of financial wealth and assets. For working class families, wealth often takes the form of home. If they own a home, if folks own a home, the home equity, maybe savings, maybe some retirement funds, and a huge percentage of the society has zero or negative wealth. Really, 1 out of 5 households, 0 or negative wealth. And if we look at through a racial lens, 30 to 40% of Blacks and Latinos, 0 or negative wealth. So wealth tells another story as part of understanding how these inequality trends. And if we just focus on income and fixing income, then we leave the sort of deeper, entrenched structural inequalities of wealth inequality in place. So we really have to address both.
Let's move into today. I mean, we all were back in February, and the world certainly had plenty of problems, but I don't think any of us realized what we were headed into. I happened to be over in Europe at the time, and the way in which the coronavirus swept through that continent and then through the United States was just mind blowing. So here we all are, and we are enduring quarantine and struggling with reopening, and the whole economy seems to be tumbling into a terrible hole, but not for everybody. Tell us about your research that gives us an idea of what's happening. I mean, are the super wealthy experiencing the same downturns, and are they, or is the economy so screwed up that they're doing fine?
Well, Bob, back in February, when you were still trying to get back to the United States, there were all these stories in the paper. Oh, global billionaires have lost all this wealth. U.S. billionaires' wealth down 400 billion. There were these headlines, and we do an annual report that looks at the U.S. billionaires and how much their wealth has changed from one year to the next. So we were just on track to do that, and in fact, we looked at March 18th. That was the date at which, Forbes actually pinned their annual global wealth survey of billionaires. And we found, yes, lo and behold, the billionaire wealth had declined from a year ago, 2019, by, a couple $100 billion. But then we started to watch what was happening. And within a month, billionaire wealth had recovered. And right up until really the last 3 months, billionaire wealth has now surged well beyond where it was last year, and is surging way beyond where it was March 18th. So, each week employment numbers are released. So, June 11th, a million people at that point had filed for unemployment since March 18th. And over those same 12 weeks, billionaire wealth had surged, over $600 billion. So within that, there are certain billionaires who've seen their wealth double. And there are certain billionaires that have seen their wealth go up even more. So part of what we did was we got in there and tried to understand, why is that happening? And I would say some of the people who've seen their wealth grow are essentially profiteering off of this unfortunate circumstance. But I think the most important point here is the pandemic is not affecting everybody the same. Some people are losing their jobs. Some people are losing their life or their long-term health, and some are prospering greatly. And the real, I think, bad effect of that is that this unequal sacrifice undermines the solidarity and unity we're going to need to come together to recover from this. It creates that sense like, oh, the rich are not in the same boat. They've de-linked from the rest of society, and that's and everybody else should just run and grab all they can. And that is not the cultural message we need to emerge from this pandemic with any kind of social contract, civic health in place.
Your work really, I think, ignited around the world, which is really amazing. Over 200 media shares. It's really been the instinct your team had to find out this research. I mean, I know you were doing it on an annual basis, but to get at the bottom of this, I think the world is in your debt to know this information. And at the end of the report, you listed such great short-term and long-term recommendations on how we can ensure that this post-pandemic recovery doesn't worsen inequality. It has the potential to diminish it. Would you want to go into some suggestions that your team has, recommended that we can build towards this better world through this crisis and our response to this crisis?
Sure. Let me mention a few things. One is in how the stimulus bills and how the government recovery proposals come down. It's very important that there not be profiteering, that wealthy corporations don't take take half the treasury, that companies that use offshore tax havens and hide their money should not be getting government support. There's ways in which we can apply the stimulus bills and the recovery investments to ensure this. During World War II, it was considered unseemly to profiteer. In fact, Harry Truman built his political career that led to the presidency by running what was called the Truman Committee, which was overseeing and investigating war profiteering during World War II. So I think we need to have that similar oversight spirit. We need to have a people's bailout, a people's recovery that I would say lifts up the most vulnerable. So I think those are all important recommendations. I think, we have discovered the important role of frontline workers are the most vulnerable and underpaid folks that many of them do not have health insurance, and yet they are on the front lines of making our economy work right now. So I think there are things that we can do, like raise the minimum wage, raise the floor, family medical leave, things that will greatly improve the quality of life for low-wage workers in this country. So that's something we should do.
I kind of, as a follow-up, you've written about the importance of a charity stimulus package as a way to immediately, through no burden of the taxpayers, get resources to initially cover the first part, up to 2 trillion, the first few trillion of this bailout relief package that we've put out there already. Could you describe what an ideal charity stimulus package would look like, and why a lot of the donor funded funds, people might not know what that is? Would you mind describing?
Yeah, thank you for asking that, because I think it's not that well misunderstood. Uh, in our charity system, mostly wealthy donors give substantial gifts to foundations, private foundations that they control, and donor-advised funds. They take a substantial tax break. For the very wealthy, it could be as much as 70 cents on the dollar is taken in terms of taxes that they don't have to pay. So we, the taxpayers, subsidize these private donors. But then this wealth will can sit in a private foundation in perpetuity. Private foundations are required to pay out 5% a year. But other than that, there's no other requirement that money move to actual working charities. Donor advised funds, there is no mandate that the funds ever get paid out. So our point is that there's a lot of wealth. We estimate $1.2 trillion of wealth sitting in these private foundations and donor advised funds, and that Congress should mandate a higher payout, an emergency payout. And our proposal is for the next 3 years, foundations at a 10% rate and donor advised funds have a payout. And that would move $200 billion over 3 years to the nonprofit sector, to the food banks, to the frontline charities that are helping people respond. And the good news is it's already been paid for by tax breaks that wealthy donors already have taken. So by Congress mandating that increased payout, it would have a positive effect without adding to the debt. And our sense is that as the summer wears on, we're going to hit trillion fatigue. Congress is going to start to get more and more anxious about appropriating trillions of dollars for all the things that are required. And they should be focused on that. They should be doing whatever is required to get the economy going. But to be able to say, look, here's $200 billion of emergency charity stimulus, that could make a difference. So, and we have a whole campaign around that at charitystimulusnow.org. People can learn about how to get in to support that proposal.
Amazing.
Chuck, you've had some interesting support from some billionaires about all of this. Could you talk about these amazingly wealthy people who recognize that this is a distortion and maybe they don't need every last penny? Who do you work with, or who is taking that role?
Well, it's an important part of the strategy for change. I really, and I learned that 20 years ago when George W. Bush tried to get rid of the estate tax, the inheritance tax, um, which is only paid by less than 1%. And I got a call from Bill Gates's dad, Bill Gates Sr., saying, I support what you're doing. How can I help? And he helped organize 1,500 multimillionaires and billionaires to publicly come out in support of the estate tax. And in recent years, we've built this network called the Patriotic Millionaires, which are both entrepreneurial wealth and some inherited wealth, but mostly, people who are successful business leaders who believe that they should pay a fair share of taxes, that wages should be higher, that our democracy shouldn't be, up for auction to the highest bidder, and they are willing to speak out. And a number of patriotic millionaires have led this effort. We have 450 foundation trustees, people who have donor advised funds calling for the emergency charity stimulus. We have hundreds of multimillionaires and billionaires who've stepped up to support proposals to increase tax wealthy, which is clearly part of what we're going to need to do going forward. We even have a group of millionaires and billionaires who are saying we should close down the offshore tax havens and all the loopholes that allow the super wealthy to hide their money. And Bob, as you point out, they are a really important voice, because this isn't necessarily a class warfare message. It's actually, these are people who you can't accuse them of class warfare. They come from the richest 1%. They are from that group, and they see how these inequalities undermine the quality of life for everybody, even the wealthy, and they're willing to speak out. And so that's an important voice in these movements.
So the concept of leveraging the tax system as a tool to fight against inequality, I think that's not being leveraged as much as possible, clearly. I know you've written a lot about the estate tax and the history of it, and how Teddy Roosevelt brought that to life in the last Gilded Era. Could you talk loosely about what the future of the estate tax could look like, and how we could use that as a tool in our belt to fight inequality?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we talk about tax policy, it's important to realize, yes, some of these proposals raise revenue, but they have the really important role of slowing the concentration of wealth and power, and preventing, I think the United States is becoming more of an oligarchy, a society controlled and governed by a small group of people, not just the 1%, but I would say the top 1/10 of 1%. That's where most of the income and wealth gains have gone in the last couple decades. It's one of the reasons with this slide here that the median wealth in the United States is so much lower than other countries who are committed to reducing the concentration of wealth and lifting the floor for everyone else. The US has much greater inequality than most industrial societies. So both how we come out of this pandemic and going forward, I would argue we need a plutocracy prevention program that includes a millionaire surtax. Incomes over $3 million should have a surtax. We should tax income from investments, capital gains, the same as we do income from work at a very high level. So a 10% emergency income tax surcharge. We could restore the estate tax to become a more robust tax. The estate tax really only applies now to households with wealth starting at about 12 million and up, couples with 24 million and up. I mean, we're talking about a tiny sliver of households. We could make it more progressive so that when you get to billionaires, the estate tax is a higher percentage. That's essentially our inheritance tax. We should implement what Senator Sanders and Senator Warren have talked about, a wealth and annual tax. Again, starting at 30 million and up, maybe a 1% annual wealth tax. But when you get to billions, maybe that wealth tax is closer to Senator Sanders' proposal of an 8%. That sounds extremely high, but if our goal is to restore to save democracy and restore the kind of equilibrium in the society, we have to do something to reduce those democracy distorting concentrations of wealth and power.
What does this show that we need to know?
Look how the median wealth, the wealth of the household in the middle in the United States at the very end is lower than say compared to Sweden or other European social democracies at the left end. Meaning, and why is it that those countries have so much less inequality? It's because they do more to raise the floor, to have a decency floor through which people can't fall, and to help ordinary households build wealth and savings. And they do more to tax and discourage concentrations of wealth and power. And it doesn't have to be just through taxation.
Just remind people who may forget their high school statistics, the median is the point at which half the people above and half the people are below. So it's not the same as an average. It's the place that the balances out in terms of numbers. How many people are above this number, and the median is at the exact half point. So that tells you sort of where the center of gravity of people's normal income would be. Or is this wealth? No, this is wealth. Right. So a healthy country would show a higher median because it means that more people below are within range of the people of the top. I mean, that's a more rational thing. And that red bar there says that the United States is way out of whack with other countries, if I'm correct.
Yeah, and Bob, this is so important because all the research shows that the economies that have that higher median are just healthier. There's more equity and equality. There's less polarization. The economy is more stable. There's less volatility. Too much inequality actually undermines economic health and well-being.
On a global scale here, I've seen your research cite that there's potentially up to 21 trillion in assets and offshore accounts, along with trusts and shell companies. How do we go about initiating a global tax reform system? Because I feel like that's a culture change, but there's also some policies that can be pushed forward. But I definitely see the need to do both national and international projects that push this forward.
Yeah, and this Tom is something that we as a society are not talking enough about. And if we want to have any kind of fair and progressive tax system, we're going to have to deal with the fact that trillions are kind of flowing out the back door, escaping from taxation. Now, how has that happened? Well, there's a whole, I call it the wealth defense industry, that help the very super rich. And when I say super rich, I'm talking about people whose wealth starts at 30 million and up. Helps them figure out how to hide their money, transfer it to the next generation without paying taxes. And they use trusts, they used offshore companies, they use shell companies that who the real owners are, and they park that money in all kinds of vehicles. And this is a global trend, and we're just looking at how globally the richest 1% owns 44% of the world's wealth. That's the wealth that we know about. We think there's much more wealth that isn't even being counted in that picture. So the first thing we need to do is get the United States to get our own in order, if you will. The United States, we are a tax haven. People bring their hidden wealth from all over the world, money that's been looted from their home countries. They bring it to the United States, launder it, and purchase real estate and purchase assets and invest it here using shell companies. South Dakota is now one of the global homes for creating what they call dynasty trusts that are set up to wealth for centuries, taking it out of the system of accounting and taxation. So, we all have heard about Delaware, that if you want to create a shell company and engage in criminal activity, if you're a sex trafficker, chances are you're using a Delaware limited liability company to hide who you are and hide your money. These are things that are happening in the United States. So we have to get our own house in order. We have to shut down our hidden wealth industry here. And then we should use our global stature and leverage to enter into treaties and require other countries to follow the same rules. Transparency, disclose who are behind corporations. There's no reason why there should be absolute secrecy in who owns real estate, who owns assets in this country. And if the United States and the United Kingdom together cleaned up our own act and then put pressure on all the sort of satellite nations of the world to raise their standards, we could shut down this hidden wealth industry within a decade. But we have to start here.
What organizations besides IPS are doing that? As like a quick, where can our audience look for leadership on this?
Actually, in the United States, there's a great network called the FACT Coalition, the Financial Accountability Corporate Transparency Network. And that is kind of a table, a place where all of us come together to strategize and work together. There's a great group called Transparency International, which works internationally, Global Witness, the Project on Government Oversight. Those are all groups that are leading in the fight for transparency and shutting down hidden wealth. And I have a new book coming out. Now, hopefully I can come talk to you in the fall. It's called The Wealth Hoarders: How Billionaires Pay Millions to Hide Trillions. So I'm very interested in, we're building up a whole program at the Institute for Policy Studies to address the problems.
Already moving into the last 15 minutes, which is amazing. So I was hoping that you could release even more the inner revolutionary and sort of imagine what we could do. I mean, now turn it from maybe to must. We must do this, and particularly since our political turmoil isn't over, and we have no idea what exactly is going to happen in November or afterwards, or how much damage Trump might do if he becomes a lame duck, etc. But to fire us up about what needs to happen. And by the way, one of the things that you're always so measured and thoughtful and friendly. This is a place where you can show a little spark of prophetic passion here, because this is outrageous. And as someone who wants to see the United States continue to exist and to improve, this seems like a major threat. So help us understand what the viewers of this, how we could participate, and maybe even we could get a list of the kinds of organizations that you talked about in FACT and Transparency International and others, and post that so that we can help move forward. So go ahead, let it rip. We got about 10 minutes.
Okay. Well, if you think about when we came out of the 2008, 2009 Great Recession, there was a lot of anger. And some of that was channeled into the Tea Party movement, a kind of a regressive populism. Look, the economy's become more unequal. The middle class has lost wealth. Let's blame immigrants and people of color. The Tea Party was about scapegoating. But there was also the Occupy movement and the We Are the 99% and that movement. And I think coming out of this pandemic, we're going to see a similar surge. That's what's, the Black Lives Matter movement is in the streets focusing on police misconduct and police brutality. But behind that is the deep understanding of the color of this pandemic, which is that Black and brown and Native people have, borne the brunt of the virus in terms of death and disability and the vulnerability. And I would say behind that anger is the legacy of racism in wealth building and economic inequality. So the first, starting point is just to recognize, white supremacy is the pre-existing condition that our society is experiencing this pandemic through. Extreme inequality is the pre-existing condition. It could have been so much better. Fewer people could have died. Fewer people could have suffered if we didn't go into this with the kind of fragility of a society where for decades we've been disinvesting public health. If we had a public health system that lifted up everybody, if we had, we didn't have this kind of grotesque racial wealth divide, our national response to this pandemic would be different. And we should be furious about that. We should be furious, and we should, whenever it's safe, be taking to the streets, removing people from office who created the preconditions that led to this. We should use it as a way to strengthen our resolve to eliminate the racial wealth divide in a decade. Here's the thing: we know how to do this. Coming out of the 2008, 2009 economic meltdown, the policies that were put in place to save Wall Street and hurt Main Street worsened the racial wealth divide, worsened inequality, created more fragility and vulnerability. So we have to fight to have a program I call it just the program that reweaves us back together. I could say the components of that. We have a report called "White Supremacy is the Existing Condition: 8 Solutions to Ensure that this recovery closes the racial wealth divide." So there are things that we can do specifically through the lens of the racial wealth gap. Here's one example. We should expand the post office to have what they call postal banking. The post office used to a source of for small deposits and for check cashing. And actually, you've probably read "The Warmth of Other Suns." Great history of the Great Migration in the United States. And I'm reading about how African Americans in the South didn't have access to the bank. They put their money in a postal bank account. So there's millions of people who are unbanked in the society. We should have a public option when it comes to the banking sector, and it should be housed with the post office, a trusted institution in both rural and inner city areas. That's just an example. But the big picture is we have to put forward an agenda that raises the floor, universal health insurance, delinked from a job. That is such a no-brainer. And 4 months ago, people were arguing about Medicare for all. Now it's like, please, why is our health insurance tied to precarious employment? Why isn't it universal? Why do so many people have to decide whether they have to go to work or potentially ill or not? So things that raise that decency floor, investments that sort of move and create opportunity for everyone else, about abolition of student debt, things that help people get on the wealth building, asset building train. But in order for us to raise the floor and address those inequities, we have to address this mountain of concentrated wealth and power that is like standing in the way. And we have to change the stories and narratives that justify those inequities. That I call it the mythology of deservedness, that everyone is where they deserve to be. And the good news, Bob and Tom, is that this agenda is wildly popular, that 80% of the population supports having the wealthy pay their fair share, expanding universal health insurance, elimination of student debt, raising the minimum wage to a decent wage for low-wage workers. Now it's really a democracy problem. How do we get the oligarchs who have captured our political system out of the way and hurt the public will? And that will require all kinds of mobilization and action.
So from my perspective, a big reason why we started this show was because we see that these are widely popular issues, but the media isn't necessarily telling the stories that need to be told. And I think a big part of that is monopolies own 90% of what the majority of Americans see every day. And to me, there has to be something done about that. I mean, the work you're doing is so amazing and it's spreading. But I'm curious, do you see any ways that we can improve the American media paradigm to be more of a voice for long-term problem solving? Um, is there anything that we can practically do? Is it a culture shift? How do we move this? Because from my perspective, the American media industry, as it currently stands, might be the organization holding back American democracy or global democracy as a whole the most.
Well, and I think as this graphic shows so well, there's been such a consolidation in media and ownership, and I don't think there's a one answer to this, but a clearly building up the alternatives, building up vibrant, independent sources of information and media, and antitrust, breaking up the monopolies, breaking up the concentration. So, over the last couple decades, you just look at what's happened to talk radio. Independent radio in this country has almost vanished. I used to know hundreds of locally produced talk shows. I would be a guest on them. They've all vanished, and now you just have a few mega stations and mega networks. So our democracy is impoverished by this lack of independent media. So I think it's both supporting the renewal of independent media, and good old antitrust breaking up the powerful monopolies and breaking them into pieces in the same way we broke up the phone companies a generation ago into decentralized networks.
Thank you.
Well, we are running right up against the end here. So perhaps, Chuck, we'll invite you to share your action steps or your call to action with our team. I just want to add that the Institute for Policy Studies is doing extraordinary work, and we will add the URL and perhaps a bunch of other addresses so that people can track things down. And then we're going to ask you to make a statement after this show is done that we will also make available about your personal desire for what world you want. So help us wrap up with an appeal to action and a sense of where that action might be most valuable.
And I might try and fit in there the form of scholarship that IPS embraces,
Yeah.
Combining data and movements. How important of a value is that in part of your mission?
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I think that when faced with these daunting challenges, I think it can be discouraging, but I think to realize social movements are what make history, and we're living through social movements. The Black Lives Matter movement, the movements yet to be born that are going to address these extreme inequalities, movements of young people addressing student debt. And I think whatever age we are, we need to find ways to support and be involved and engage in those social movements. See this is the most critical transformative moment of our lives. The next 2 years will be like 1935, 1936, 1966, 67. It will be a transformative set of years. So I think it's if you're in the quarantine right now, rest up a little bit, study up, fortify yourself for the years ahead. We're going to be having to use every ounce of our energy and creativity, and there's a role for everybody. If you're not somebody who wants to be out in the street, but you're an artist, or you're a singer, or you are really good at talking to people one-to-one, there is a role for everybody in building this transformation. So I think it's a moment that allows us to dream big, to have the kind of conversations you're having. What is the kind of world we want? Put it out there. Put your vision out there, and dream big. They say that to change your habits, you need about 8 weeks. You want to have a better diet, or you want to do something differently, you need to sort of discipline yourself for 8 weeks to change your habits. think of this time, this pandemic moment, as a time to sort of build new habits, build new muscles, build new capacities in each of us so that we can be part of the change that so urgently is required.
Amazing. I think we have a quick two things. You've used the term civic imagination, and to me, it just stuck so well. And I think that that's one of the cultural lackings we have right now, is the ability to think of, and as Bob has told me before, we have to articulate something in order to create it. So I think that, what does civic imagination mean to you? And then also to our audience, how can they both help you? Is it, going to and sharing IPS studies? Is it going to inequality.org? Is it signing petitions? Like, how can our audience help you?
I think we may be able to imagine something for each of our own lives. What is it that each of us individually imagine? But we need to cultivate our civic imagination. It does not have to be this way. These extreme inequalities, these racial disparities, it does not have to be this way. And so cultivating our civic imagination is to envision how things could be. We are getting glimpses of that during the pandemic. We see people's generosity, we see solidarity, see people standing up for one another. We see white people, engaging and learning about the roots of white supremacy and acting upon that. We see people leading and inspiring others. So that's a key ingredient to cultivating the civic imagination and making it happen at all the levels. And I would invite people, I think, is to check out what we do at inequality.org. We're trying to lift both the movements, the bold solutions, the faces on the front line, try to have a little bit of a sense of humor as we look at sometimes the daunting data and barriers. Plug into, wherever you can, plug into social movements. People say, what is it I can do? And there's almost nothing individually you can do without being part of something bigger. Whether you form a group of 3 and you support one another to take bold action in your lives, or join a large organization. And you'll find some of those links and organizations at inequality.org. And find your way, and whether it's 1 hour a week or it's all your life, devote yourself to that work.
Beautiful.
Well, this has been absolutely fascinating. And Chuck, I'm excited by the idea that we can have you back when your book comes out. And we would love to continue to explore the topics that you're working on that our viewers may want to hear more about. And I think that we believe we're opening up a new kind of conversation. Obviously, there's lots of them going on, but we are hoping that this particular venue will open up for, as we've hoped from the beginning, a kind of deeper conversation, and that helps us integrate not only our politics, but our lives and our sense of past, present, and future. So you've been so incredibly helpful, and I want to thank you on behalf of everyone for the work that you and your colleagues do, and others at IPS, and so many other networks that you're part of.
Thanks for all the homework you did to make this possible. I appreciate it.
And so I'll just say thank you. Tom, do you have any parting words?
It's an honor, Chuck. Again, we're always here to be part of the movements that you're facilitating. I think the biggest myth is that we're more divided than separated. I think that the majority of humanity is on the same page, and as we're building these conversations to push us forward, then I think that turns into democratic policies, democratic victories that lead to hopefully systems change. But we have to have the civic imagination to get there first. So again, thank you for your time. Thank you to our audience for tuning in. It's an honor to have these conversations. Feel free to reach out at any point to help contribute to these conversations, as that's the ultimate goal, is we want to talk and turn into action.
We want to hear from people, your suggestions about topics, your suggestions about guests. And one of the interesting things about being in this format is, though we have emphasized primarily leaders of all ages and backgrounds from the Boston area. But with this format, we can go a little farther out. So thank you to our audience. Thank you to Chuck. Thank you to IPS. Thank you to John Logan, who is the ghost behind all of this, is making it work. And to all the others who've contributed. And come back for the rest of season 2. We're excited. Thank you very much. Stay busy, stay committed. We look forward to seeing you again soon.